A 25-year-old seamstress strangled her own 5-year-old son with her bare hands. She dug a pit in the woods and quietly buried the small, lifeless body. Among the evidence, the prosecutor found the boy's hat, a shoe covered in dirt, and a rope taken from the boy's neck. The prosecutor's wife felt a lump in her throat, unable to understand what kind of cold-blooded woman could be so cruel to her own child. When the police found Frieda, there was not a trace of fear on her face. This calmness felt far more chilling than any heart-wrenching sobbing. The case of a mother killing her own son shocked the entire nation, and everyone condemned her as a monster unworthy of being a mother. Yet no one was willing to ask what this woman named Frieda had actually been through. As the prosecutor's wife, Erna was kind and perceptive, possessing a natural female intuition and compassion. Inside the detention cell, she could hardly believe her eyes when she first saw Frieda. In Erna's stereotype, Frieda should have been a hideous villain, but instead, she wore a delicate long dress and well-fitted shoes, carrying a faint elegance of an upper-class woman. The moment the cell door opened, Frieda instinctively moved toward the wall. This was the first exchange of glances between two women from completely different social classes. Frieda did not respond. Instead, her eyes lingered on the hem of Erna's clothing.
Der botte slysnåt. Schultere. Ich will singen so.
And just like that, their brief meeting came to an end. Early the next morning, Erna brought her freshly cleaned prison clothes and personally cut her long hair short. During the interrogation by Prosecutor Walter, Frieda remained silent throughout. She calmly admitted that she had killed her son, but the judge found this far from sufficient. He needed to know what had truly happened. Bertha, Frieda's sister, came from the same lower-class background. However, through marriage, she had entered a working-class family that could barely make ends meet. Even with a family, her life hovered on the edge of poverty. She hoped the police could bring an apple to Frieda, but they ignored her request. To help her sister, Bertha and her husband sought out a young lawyer named Arnold. Arnold had a complicated relationship with the prosecutor, both adversarial and respectful, and he was a well-educated and respectable man. The brother-in-law explained that Frieda had always lived with them, while Ernst had previously been in an orphanage. On the second day after the boy's body was discovered, Walter confirmed with the orphanage director that the clothes on the deceased indeed belonged to the boy Ernst. The orphanage had fostered him for 5 years, and Frieda had only taken her son back 4 weeks ago, leaving many unpaid fostering fees. From Bertha and her husband's words, Arnold confirmed that Frieda's son was born out of wedlock. They could not afford the additional cost of raising him and feared that this illegitimate child would drag their family into scandal. Bertha said that no one truly knew what Frieda had been through, and she was nothing like what the newspapers described. From the trembling corners of Bertha's lips, it was clear that Frieda had been surrounded by suffering from the very beginning. Despite their poverty, Bertha took out all her savings, hoping Arnold would take on her sister's case. When it came to the child's biological father, Bertha avoided the topic. Perhaps she simply did not dare to say more. Arnold's fiancée Jessine was a representative figure of the emerging feminist movement in Switzerland at the time. She said Frieda was either driven into a corner with no way out, or she was simply a shameless woman. At that moment, Sophie stepped forward. Sophie was a worker at the tailor shop and had worked with Frieda for many years. She believed Frieda was not the kind of person Jessine described. Frieda was both intelligent and polite. Although her life was extremely difficult, she maintained good relationships with her co-workers at the shop. As for the fact that Frieda had a child, Sophie found it hard to believe, as it did not match Frieda's character at all. At that time, Frieda was trying on clothes in the shop when a woman suddenly came looking for her. The woman was the director of the orphanage. Sophie saw the two arguing outside but did not hear what they were arguing about. Afterward, she did not ask, nor did she want Frieda to feel like she had been eavesdropping. Inside the prison cell, Frieda not only endured the strange looks of male guards but also had to constantly guard herself against inappropriate behavior from outside the cell. Because she had triangular-shaped ears, the guards assumed she was a natural-born killer. Although Erna sympathized with Frieda, constrained by her husband's authority and her social status, she did not dare to interfere too much. Erna represented those upper-class women who possessed conscience but lacked action. Though her power was limited, her kindness became a beam of light for Frieda in the darkness. Walter firmly believed in the decisiveness of the law and the sanctity of morality. He could not understand Frieda's situation and saw her as a threat to the moral order of society. In Frieda's residence, there was a blueprint that he could never figure out.
Schnittmuster Walti. Für Kinderkleidli, so wie es aussieht.
Early the next morning, Bertha found Erna while she was at work. She brought some clothes for her sister and willow bark specifically to treat her headaches. Inside the dark cell, Rats could be seen everywhere, wearing the new clothes. Frieda carefully adjusted a flaw on Erna's left shoulder. As a skilled seamstress, Erna believed Frieda should have earned a decent wage and should not have fallen to such a state. Opening a shop to make a living seemed like a fallback option in Erna's eyes. Yet she overlooked the limitations of Frieda's lower-class reality. With no capital, no connections, and burdened with a child stigmatized by society, this suggestion was ultimately a well-meaning idea detached from reality. Frieda said that when all you can do is wait for death to bring release, life feels unbearably long. Erna asked what Ernst needed to be freed from, and she answered, from life itself, from all the illnesses brought by winter, from the stomach cramps caused by hunger, from every contemptuous gaze, from the identity of being born out of wedlock, and from being by my side. This conversation left Erna speechless, and it was also Frieda's most honest confession. In her eyes, death was not a cruel killing, but the only way to free the child from all suffering. That afternoon, Walter went to the orphanage on his own initiative. He hoped to further understand Frieda's motive for the crime, but all he saw was a group of homeless children. Along with Frieda's unpaid bills and a few letters, Walter found no useful clues at the orphanage. On his way back, a frustrated Walter ran into the young lawyer Arnold. Now that Arnold had officially taken over Frieda's case, he hoped to meet his client. However, Walter firmly refused his request, insisting that Frieda was a murderer with conclusive evidence against her. After their previous conversation, Erna had developed a certain level of trust in Frieda. She brought a few pieces of clothing and some knitting needles, hoping Frieda would have something to occupy herself in the cell.
Brauchst du noch etwas? Könnt ihr echt noch ein bisschen mehr Widerrinde haben? Gegen das Kopf.
Walter was preparing to run for a seat in the Swiss Federal Council. He needed achievements and an image of being an impartial enforcer of morality. To him, Frieda's case was not just a criminal matter, but a stepping stone in his political career. So he had to portray Frieda as a cold-blooded killer in order to win public attention and support. Faced with Walter's interrogation, Frieda remained silent the entire time. Among the letters found at the orphanage, Walter discovered a man named Helene who had been in close contact with Frieda. Walter asked her who that man really was. When Frieda did not respond, Walter casually pulled out the child's autopsy report. The harsh words and the signs of suffocation nearly broke the usually composed Frieda. But at that very moment, Erna suddenly appeared and stopped her husband. Erna loved her husband deeply, but she did not want him to become a council member through such extreme means. In order to find more evidence, Walter went to Frieda's place of registered residence. There, he obtained a crucial piece of information. Frieda had been violated by a tavern owner named Karl. In Swiss society in 1904, a lower-class woman working in a tavern was already seen as morally questionable. Even if the tavern owner had a relationship with her, Walter tended to believe that Frieda had willingly seduced him for survival or other motives. At Frieda's registered residence, Walter also found Helene's workplace. Helene was a railway worker who had met Frieda at a marketplace. In Helene's memory, Frieda was a good woman. She was not only beautiful and dignified, but also never behaved recklessly or in a way that violated social norms. Helene and Frieda might have developed their relationship further, but due to a job transfer, Helene had to move to another city, Zurich, for work. From that point on, they lost contact, and Helene never received another reply from Frieda. Meanwhile, taking advantage of Walter's absence from the prosecutor's office, the lawyer Arnold met Frieda with Erna's assistance. Back when Arnold and his fiancée used to visit the tailor shop, Sophie had even joked about him.
Die Länge von der Kreuznadel nach hat etwas zu bieten.
What Arnold did not expect was that Frieda did not want his help at all. She refused to answer any of his questions and firmly admitted that she had killed her son. Left with no other choice, Arnold gave Frieda some paper and a pen. He hoped she would write down every detail of her life, whether bright or dark. After meeting Frieda, Arnold took the initiative to visit his brother-in-law. He felt that Bertha had held something back during their last conversation.
Besser man schweigt, besser man vergisst. Da hat ihn ihre Mutter immer eingebläut. Aber unter uns, ein schweigsames Frauenzimmer erspart einem nur so manches.
In fact, both Bertha and her husband knew about the child. After Frieda became pregnant, their father cast her out of the house for bringing shame to the family, and she had been staying with her sister ever since. Paying a small fee for lodging, Frieda had once tried to terminate the pregnancy. She even threw herself down the stairs, but it failed. She had repeatedly begged her sister to take in the child, but Bertha feared gossip from others. With no other option, Frieda sent her son to the orphanage. Arnold also learned an important fact, that the child's biological father was a tavern owner. When Arnold found Karl, he showed no reaction to the child's death. In Carl's eyes, Frieda was nothing more than a lower-class worker in his tavern, and the child was merely the result of a moment of impulse. He showed not the slightest trace of sympathy for Frieda or the boy. In order to campaign for his position, Walter hosted a banquet inside the prison. Unfortunately, the maid responsible for serving the dishes injured her shoulder just before the meal began. In the midst of the urgency, Erna thought of Frieda, who was in the prison. Among the distinguished guests at the banquet, no one would pay attention to what a servant looked like. Although the banquet was lavish, every topic revolved around Frieda's case. Every official present looked down on Frieda, and some even suggested she should be sentenced to death. In fact, Walter had been searching for evidence to confirm Frieda's intent to kill, because only then could he sentence her to death. Faced with these aggressive and humiliating remarks, Frieda could only endure them in silence. After the banquet ended, Erna expressed her gratitude to Frieda on Walter's behalf. Erna could understand Frieda's feelings at this moment, but her ability to help was truly limited. After Erna left, Frieda took a big bite of an apple for the first time, and this was exactly a sign of her fear. That night, Frieda took out the paper and pen Arnold had given her. Under the dim light, she wrote down every moment of despair in her life, and through Erna's hands, it was delivered to the lawyer Arnold. Using Frieda's handwritten account, Arnold began to develop a series of defense strategies for her. Frieda had suffered from severe meningitis as a child, which was also the main reason for her constant headaches. A few days later, the lawyer Arnold held a grand wedding with his fiancée. Frieda could only silently send her blessings to Arnold from prison, together with Erna. However, this joyous day also happened to be the birthday of Frieda's son, Ernst. Recalling the past birthdays she had spent with her son, Frieda felt a deep sense of sorrow. She had thought she would not care about such things, and would simply wait quietly in prison for death. But memories surged like overwhelming waves, constantly lingering in her mind. Everywhere she turned, now Frieda no longer believed in her mother's teachings to remain silent and forget the past. Even as she faced the darkest moment of impending death, Frieda chose to confront this society and its unjust laws. She wanted the world to know how she had transformed from a kind lower-class worker into the so-called murderer in everyone's eyes. The conversation from the day left Erna unable to sleep all night, and she secretly lit birthday candles for Ernst in the prison. The table full of candles was a belated birthday, and an unspoken prayer. Frieda personally lit one for her son. Staring at the flickering flame, all her composure and restraint collapsed in an instant. She cried out toward the statue behind her. It was a mother's repentance, and also the despair of someone from the lowest class. Early the next morning, Walter interrogated Frieda once again, using the railway worker Helene as a starting point. He claimed that the child had interfered with their free relationship, so Frieda took the opportunity to kill her own son. This time, Frieda did not remain silent. Walter also learned about his wife's assistance to Arnold, and he lashed out at Erna in anger. He believed his wife should not have allowed Frieda to meet Arnold, nor should she have sympathized with a woman who killed her own child. Their argument grew increasingly intense. Helpless, Erna took Frieda's handwritten account from the prison. She wanted her husband to be a just prosecutor, not someone who would fabricate and slander a desperate lower-class woman for the sake of becoming a council member. Meanwhile, Arnold was carefully planning Frieda's defense. His wife Jessine had her own opinion, believing they should focus on the tavern owner Carl. But in that society at the time, even a woman riding a bicycle in public would be judged as improper. A married man would not face prosecution even if he assaulted another woman, and instead the woman would be labeled immoral and forced to bear the consequences herself. On the day of Frieda's trial, Erna brought her a set of clothes, the very one Frieda had sewn herself in prison. The prison incident had caused quite a sensation, and the courtroom was filled with reporters and spectators. As the prosecutor, Walter firmly believed this was a premeditated murder. Ernst was the unintended result of Frieda's time working temporarily at the tavern, where she could not resist the persistent advances of the owner Carl. At that time, there was even a strange belief that if a woman's earlobes were triangular in shape, she was naturally inclined to steal and lie. Walter also brought two witnesses. One was the director of the orphanage where Ernst had been fostered, who testified that Frieda was negligent and failed to take responsibility for her child, and was not even very familiar with him. The other witness was the railway worker Helene, who used their past correspondence to portray Frieda as an improper woman. He further claimed that Frieda wanted to get rid of her child to live a free and carefree life, concluding that the murder had been premeditated. As the defense lawyer, Arnold did not offer a weak justification for Frieda's act of killing her child. What he sought to expose was the coldest truth of this world. Perhaps it was Frieda's hands that ended the child's life, but what drove her to desperation was the unjust law that allowed the tavern owner to go unpunished. It was the patriarchal society that ignored the suffering of lower-class women, and the indifference and prejudice of everyone who turned a blind eye. It was the monthly 5 francs in foster fees that she could not afford even while working tirelessly. Arnold's questions were meant to make everyone in the courtroom see clearly. The one who should truly be judged was never this desperate mother, but the twisted system that created tragedy and oppressed the weak. Finally, he solemnly questioned Walter. "You represent this society and its double standards. So tell me, Mr. Walter, if it were you, would you take in this child burdened with shame?" Arnold's powerful defense earned rounds of applause from the audience. However, this could not erase Frieda's crime. The court ultimately ruled that Frieda was guilty of murder and sentenced her to death. Yet this verdict was not accepted by everyone, and it sparked widespread controversy across society, especially among workers who lived in the same lower class as Frieda. They pleaded for justice, for women's freedom, and strongly demanded that Frieda be granted mercy and that the death penalty be abolished. However, there was one problem. Even as people petitioned for her pardon, Frieda herself refused. She would not speak to anyone and quietly awaited the arrival of death. Arnold had no choice but to approach his rival Walter. Now that Walter's election was almost secured, Arnold hoped he could save this unfortunate woman. Erna made the same request, hoping her husband would help Frieda. After careful consideration, Walter finally took out Frieda's handwritten account given to him by his wife. What destroyed Frieda's life was a Sunday evening. The tavern owner Karl asked her to fetch wine from the cellar, but took the opportunity to violate her. After learning the truth, Walter was filled with guilt, and he returned Frieda's writings along with Ernst's toy to her. To verify the truth of Frieda's account, Walter went to see her sister again. In fact, Bertha had also worked at the tavern before, and she too had suffered abuse from the owner. Unable to endure it, she passed the job on to Frieda. After learning the truth, Walter apologized to his wife. He also decided, like his wife and Arnold, to persuade Frieda to submit a petition. That afternoon, Bertha came to the prison to persuade her sister. She hoped Frieda could choose to live, but Frieda was determined to die. She did not want to live in a world filled with contempt and scorn. After speaking with the prosecutor, Bertha confessed everything to Frieda. It was her own wrong decision back then that had led Frieda to this point. The reason she had refused to take in the child was that she did not want to be constantly reminded of her own mistake. But Frieda could not forgive her.
Gang.
As for the tavern owner Karl, Walter also questioned him. The sequence of events matched Frieda's written account exactly. With only 2 days left before the execution, Walter went to visit Frieda. He said, "I am a prosecutor. I have no choice. But in truth, I believe you. I believe you would rather die than live dishonorably. You have already proven that, but I do not agree with what you did. You should not die. For the sake of God, speak now and plead for yourself. What you have endured, you must live on, otherwise nothing will ever change. Fight for your life." Frieda. For the past 5 years, Frieda endured the hardships and constant anxiety of life in silence, never once complaining or confiding her suffering to anyone, keeping everything buried deep inside. After her mother passed away, she lost her only support, and without her mother's care and understanding, Frieda could no longer hold herself together. In truth, she did not act out of hatred or disgust toward her child, but out of fear of condemnation and scorn. She could no longer distinguish the weight of her own guilt. Only God knew the torment in her heart. This heavy sorrow would follow her for the rest of her life. But Frieda still pleaded for mercy from society, asking for the chance to live. She hoped to atone sincerely, to change, and to find the peace and quiet she had long lost. At last, after much persuasion, Frieda submitted this hard-earned petition. After a collective vote by the council members, Frieda's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, along with a restriction on communication. This film is based on real events. Frieda Keller spent 15 years in solitary confinement, and was released in 1919 due to the deterioration of her physical and mental condition. In 1939, after suffering a stroke, she was sent to a psychiatric hospital for treatment, where she passed away 3 years later. Frieda's case became a symbol of injustice in criminal law at the time, which inspired the Swiss women's movement to demand equal rights for all. In 1942, the Swiss Criminal Code officially came into effect and abolished the death penalty. From that point on, married men could also face prosecution for acts of assault.